Welcome to the Sikh Messenger Podcast series brought to you by the network of Sikh organisations. Over the next few weeks, we will be interviewing people who are engaged in addressing the issue of hate crime, be it from a policing or public policy perspective, or hearing from victims themselves. Our focus is on the implications for British Sikhs, but we will also be looking at the wider problem in general. This initiative is brought to you as part of the Catch Together Against Hate project, which is being facilitated by Gallup and has been funded by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. Your hosts for the series are Tavleen, Herbaksh and Hardeep. This week we're delighted to be talking to Suresh Grover, one of the founders and co-directors of the Monitoring Group. Suresh has been a leading anti-racist advocate and campaigner in the UK for over 4 decades, and has led campaigns to help the families of Stephen Lawrence, Zahid Mubarak and Victoria Clambier.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very pleased that you could, given your history of campaigning against racism in the United Kingdom. If we could, can we actually start with your background, your early life, and can you tell us something about where you were born, your upbringing? And I believe much of that was in the north of England.
Yeah, listen, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on this discussion with Network of Sikh organizations. I was actually born in East Africa, in Kenya. We came into this country with my family via India in 1966. I think it's really hard winter. It's the first time I saw snow. And my father had a friend who had settled in Nelson, Lancashire, which is about 35 miles north of England. And so we ended up there. I mean, East Africa was an experience because there wasn't any demarcation between different members of the Asian community. So whether you were Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, you settled together, you went to gurdwaras or temples together. And I suppose there was a commonality that you was in a foreign country, which you still had the colonial rule. And growing up in East Africa was an eye-opener for me. I was very young when I realized that we were different, because if you entered into the European area or British farms, you were shot at. So it wasn't as ruthless as the apartheid regime in South Africa, but it was segregated and everybody had its place, and you didn't interconnect with other communities, especially in terms of African or European. And the Asians were in a hierarchy which was just below the Europeans and above the Africans. So we left at a very chaotic time, just during the independence struggle by the Kenyans, and about 3 years after the independence. You know, coming from East Africa, getting into Nelson, Lancashire was a total cultural shock. And the education system was totally different in East Africa. Most Asians thrived in mainstream subjects like English and mathematics and science. The quality of education that we've been taught in East Africa was much, much higher than in secondary modern schools that we were forced into when we were very young. There were only about, I'd say, 50 South Asian families in the whole of Nelson when we came. So when you look at the demographic of schools, there were only 12 Asians in a school of 1,000 pupils. No African Caribbeans at all. And it was really hard because the winters were very hard. People either welcomed you with open arms or they hated you because you were different. And in the North, people tell you exactly what they feel about you. There's no hypocrisy. So they say to your face that they don't like it, or actually they're very friendly with you. There's no gray areas whatsoever. I think I started becoming conscious about who I was in terms of my identity when what is now known as Paki bashing, but actually this form of racist bullying and violence against Asian community didn't differentiate whether you were Sikh, Hindu or Muslim. Anybody who was Asian was just called a Paki. And Paki bashing started with the arrival of skinheads and whole classrooms, pupils who were friends of you turning against you in a matter of weeks. There were fights in the playground. I was picked on, and it climaxed in me being stabbed by skinheads outside a cinema that I and my nephew went to. So I was stabbed just before, when I was doing A levels, and went to the police. The police officer, very senior member of a police service in Nelson, took a statement, but no one got arrested. It was never acted upon, and the bullying went on in school. And then we just had to come together, and really from survival instincts, we just began to defend ourselves. Even when you were picked up in school and you were winning a fight, other white kids would surround you, and you got beaten up anyway, and you never won any fight. So it's only when the 5 or 6 of us boys came together and started defending each other, that form of violence, that brutality began to diminish. And it finished when one of my friend's schoolmates brought a knife in school to defend himself. And it's the first time after 3 months of perpetual violence against us and bullying against us that the head teacher intervened. He could see that we were being beaten up all the time, and there were racial abuse constantly being used, that he decided to act and try to expel my friend. He didn't succeed, but for some reason, because these racists realized that we had come together and we were going to defend each other, they began to stop bullying us. Look, racism was really in your face. I mean, the woodwork teacher at school would never call me by name, by my real name, Suresh. Most of the school students never called me by my name. I was called Billy for some reason, which I never understood. Whenever I entered the woodwork class, the woodwork teacher would say, "Look, here comes Tarzan's boy," because I was come from East Africa, and everybody would laugh, and they'd make fun of where I was born. Apparently, Asians and Africans are never born in hospitals; they're born in jungles or in sea and things like that. So it's in your face. And after being stabbed, I began to rebel, and I just left Nelson because it either I would have died or somebody would have been badly injured for me taking action to defend ourselves. So I ended up in London on my own, started working when I was only 16, 17, and I accidentally discovered Southall in 1975. It was just growing. There weren't many people there, but the younger crowd was kind of dynamic. People were on the streets. And as soon as I entered Southall, I didn't have to look beyond my shoulder. So it was almost as if I was coming home. So unfortunately for me, what happened was I came to Southall in September 1975, and I kind of started working, rented a place in Southall. And then soon after, I remember on 4th of June, which was a Friday, 1976, I was coming to meet someone outside Dominion Cinema, and I saw a pool of blood across the Dominion Cinema, just outside Victory, what was then the Victory Pub. And I saw a police officer at the scene with a flat hat. I mean, we didn't have mobile phones then, but on the radio there was this news that a young Asian had been killed. And I thought, when I looked at the pool of blood, oh my God, I may be seeing the murder scene. So I just went out of curiosity, really, to the location, just crossed the road. And I said I asked the police officer, I said, what happened? Because I could see a pool of blood on the pavement. And he said, go away, it's just Indian blood. And that really got me angry.
Wow.
And, within minutes, I said, how can you say it's just Indian blood? You're talking as if this person's blood is not human. And he said, go away. I said, no, I'm not going to go away. I think what you need to do is, out of respect, put a cloth here so nobody treads on the blood. This may be, I didn't know the word forensic scene then, but I just knew instinctively and, out of common sense that you don't just stand in front of a pool of blood with people walking by. So I said, listen, you need to preserve this out of respect. And he just walked away. He just ran. And there's only me and my friend. It's not as if there was a large crowd of people. And I just thought, not only has he said it's just Indian blood, he just walked away from a murder scene. So I actually went to a shop which coincidentally was called Chuggers. It's a photography shop now, but it used to be a cloth shop. So I got whatever cloth I could. I thought maybe it was orange, maybe it was red, I can't remember. And my friend and I just put a cloth over the blood with some bricks on it so people wouldn't step on it. And then the rumors started coming that, Gurdeep Singh Chagga, a young boy, had been killed and this was racist as well. So I and my friend then wrote something on the payment, which I think was like, we'll get you, this murder will be avenged. Now, the reason why I did that was because of the experience of being beaten up. And when I came to Southall in 1975, racism was really right. The skinheads used to come, beat you up, and then just leave. And the people I'd spoken to in Southall had school bullying, etc. And I learned about the busing that had taken place in Southall, where, if schools in Southall had more than a third of so-called migrant children, they were bussed out. In fact, a young man called Abdul Malik, he was only 15, had been stabbed in a racist murder in 1974 outside Greenford bus stop because he'd been bussed. There were lots of stuff like that going on, and I just began to talk to young people because I was very young then. And when we wrote something on the pavement, people started coming out of the pub, etc., etc. We, from two people, by this must have been in the afternoon at 1 o'clock. It grew to about 1,000 young kids by 7:30 in the evening.
Right.
And people were talking what was happening, what we would do, how can we help the Chagga family. I didn't know the Chagga family at all. I didn't know who they were, where they lived. I'd only been in Southall for, as I said, 6 months, so I hadn't grown up in Southall. But this was on Friday. By Saturday, Sunday, things intensified. It was really hot summer. Saturday, there were demonstrations. Sunday, there was a meeting of the IWA at the Dominion Cinema, which was run and owned by the Indian Workers Association. It was actually the first building that was owned by an Indian community organization, I think, in the whole of the country. There was a meeting about racism, so we took over the meeting, said we have to start looking at what's happening with policing, not just of what's happening in terms of factories and schools, but what's happening on the streets in terms of what young people are doing, lack of opportunities, the growth of racism and all that stuff. And as we came out of that meeting, two white guys came out of a car and said something like, "Packies, go home." So everybody started chasing them, and it ended into a kind of chaotic scene. And the police came, instead of finding out what was happening, they just started arresting people. They arrested 3 people. And as they went towards the police station, everybody followed them to the police station. And actually, I remember on Sunday afternoon, we surrounded the police station. It looked as if there were thousands of people. Maybe there were only 2,000, but it seemed much bigger. Most of us were either Punjabi, Sikh, or a sprinkling of Afro-Caribbean people, and a few young white kids. And we stayed at the police station until they released the 3 people. And out of these events came the Southall Youth Movement, and it had a national impact because it got reported on the police, by the press, sorry. But the press, rather than acknowledging racism against the Asian Punjabi community in Southall, blamed it on the hot summer and said that somehow we were affected by the midday sun. So not there at the time. I think I can remember the headlines in the Sun which said that because it's hot, we Asians can't take the heat, therefore we rioted. I mean, just so that's and stupid because they didn't want to face that racism. It's really important, that period, because if you look at the context of 1976, just let me give you an illustration which graphically illustrates the kind of racism that existed in just 1 year. So if you look at February 1976, the National Front had started picketing outside Gatwick and Heathrow airports because of the number of Asian people who were coming from Malawi, from Uganda, and from East Africa and India itself. They didn't want migration, and they were calling for open repatriation. In 1976, June, the Grundig strike had started, which was led by Asian women in Brent. It was a fantastic, pivotal strike for the first time ever led by Asian women, although there had been other strikes before by Asian men before, which never got recognized, like the Wolf Rubbers in Southall, or Parrywell Gutterman in West London, or Imperial Typewriters in Leicester. But Grundig came, and then Chagga's murder came on the 4th of June, the establishment of the Southall Youth Movement. Then in August, you had the riots in Notting Hill Carnival for the first time ever. I think in August 76, you had Eric Clapton, who was one of the most famous, is still one of the more famous
Yeah.
guitarists, did his speech in Manchester talking about vogues and coons, which is the terms that I grew up with. Any Asian was called a coon. I didn't even know it, but it was derogatory. Where he starts saying, you coons and vogues should go back home and you shouldn't be in this country. And,
that was a man, Suresh, whose whole career was based on rhythm and blues music, black music.
Yeah, I mean, it's staggering that he says that. So that happens in August, and then in September, October, you have the National Front actually beginning to build a base and starting its profile electronically. And that's just my memory. I haven't even studied what happened in 76 or what happened in 76. Quite pivotal period. So when we talk about the history of racism and the resistance by Asian communities and the Punjabi community in Southall and other communities across the UK, we always talk about the post-76 generation, but the context is much obviously earlier. Because
and more often than not, Suresh, what actually happens is when people talk about the anti-racism movement and the changes that happened, especially in light of things like Eric Clapton's speech, what they talk about is the broader British anti-racist movement and things like Rock Against Racism. And they don't talk about the actual resistance and new forms of organisation that people like yourself were instrumental in creating. They don't actually talk about the victims of these hate crimes coming together and politicising and acting to combat racism. And that's why your story, your testimony is so important.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, these testimonies are very important. They're not acknowledged. We haven't written about our histories. It's part of a problem. We need to write those histories. We need to tell those histories. But there are two real problems. First is when we talk about anti-racist history, it's really seen from a white perspective. So you talk about Rock Against Racism rather than community defense campaigns and community self-organizations in areas like Southall. And then in the modern period, when you talk about resistance against racism, you talk about black communities rather than Asian communities, as if there's a polarization. So there's a lack of acknowledgement about the resistance created by the South Asian communities in this country, and it's not about competing with each other. It's just being historically true about what existed. And Southall's history and history in other parts of the UK, where the South Asian community, the Punjabi community, and the Sikh community, which plays a pivotal role in creating organizations like the IWAs in that period, which were very, very, very important. Campaigns on busing, on campaigns in terms of housing, campaigns on getting fair wages and trade union recognition, really important. The turban case, just before, where the right to wear a turban when you're riding a motorcycle or a thing. They're pivotal campaigns in the history of race relations, but you're right, you're absolutely right. They're not acknowledged either by the mainstream or by the left in the anti-racist history properly.
Yeah. Pradeep, did you want to just chip in quickly?
Yeah, Suresh, it's been really remarkable just hearing your story and the kind of the challenges that you faced over the years. And I hadn't realised that you'd kind of been witness to so many things, and you've been stabbed yourself. In some ways, that empowered you, and you kind of pushed back and were part of a movement for change. It seems to me that it's difficult for people like me and sort of, I guess, the younger generation to kind of understand and fathom that period. I mean, we've all heard of Paki bashing, the murder of Gurdeep Singh Jaggar, obviously a critical moment during that period, and the Southall riots and the formation of the Southall Youth Movement. And I was interested in the policy of busing that you mentioned as well. In fact, I think, we actually do know somebody that was bussed out of Southall as a school kid. But I just wanted to think about Britain now. It's a sort of very different place. Would you say we've come a long way when it comes to sort of the battle for equality that has been enshrined in law through legislation? We've got 3 Indians in the cabinet. I mean, what are your thoughts? How have things changed, and have they changed for the better?
To put it simply, some things have changed for the better, some things have remained, and some things have got worse. There's no uniform answer on that, and I think people would not be true to themselves or to the current environment if they said things have drastically or qualitatively improved for the Asian community or for other black communities in this country. I mean, just a cursory glance at, for example, disproportionality at this moment on how BME communities, and I hate that term, I don't want to use it actually, I've always never liked that term. Let me just say black, brown people and migrant people. It's just more simpler to say that. It's not the perfect thing to say, but I'll just use that term. In the 70s, I never even called myself Asian. We were part of the black community. The reason for that is really important because black was a unifying term. It wasn't a skin color for us. Because we realized that our struggles in this country, whether you were black, brown, or anything, had a commonality. We'd come from the global south, if I can call it, whether it was India or East Africa or whatever. We'd gone through colonial experiences. There was linkage to what we were doing in this country to what happened in India, for example. The penal system that created, the anti-Sikh war, hundreds of years ago. The Udham Singh, who was part of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, had come and assassinated General Dyer in this country. And I actually didn't know that Udham Singh had written in his blood, I don't know whether it's a myth or not, after witnessing the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, that his murder will be revenged in his own, by somebody's blood. And I was writing that in Southall, not even knowing that history. So there's a commonality of indignation that takes place, even though there is hundreds of years that have passed. So
yeah, and we were all referred to as black in those days, Suresh. I was referred to as black.
Just to answer your question, I'm sorry, because I just took some time answering. If you look at the amount of people who've been stopped and searched in London in May, from March to April, 21,959 young men have been stopped. 99% of them are from BME communities or black and brown communities. If you look at the amounts of people who are in prison, in youth offending institutes, it's the gross disproportionality when it comes to black and brown people. So yes, you have 3 members of cabinet and you have large sections, you have representation in parliament. But in terms of ordinary people, in terms of working people, which is actually 80% of the population, I think things have got worse. And the gains that we made on hate crimes in the Lawrence campaign, which I was, part of and coordinated, and not many people know this, for example, Doreen and Neville actually came to Southall and used to use our office as a base of the Stephen Lawrence family campaign. Doreen worked in the Southall monitoring group. And the experiences that we had galvanized in 76, 79, and 81 in Southall, we used in the Stephen Lawrence family campaign. So Southall was a learning ground for many of the campaigns that came afterwards. The recommendation of the Lawrence inquiry, some of them are pivotal and very innovative in terms of definition, changing legislation. If you look at it currently, none of them is being applied. So our figures show that from April to June, we got referred 347 cases despite COVID conditions. So hate crimes are on the increase. They're not on the decrease, right?
No.
This is not just in London, it's replicated across the country. We had a meeting with the mayor and the deputy mayor last week, and they confirmed that hate crimes are on the increase, and they haven't said that to people. So we've seen a massive increase. And those hate crimes are on the increase against every community. A lot of Asians, Sikh, Muslim, Hindus are suffering that. A lot of African Caribbean, large proportion of people who are care workers are beginning to suffer racially motivated hate crimes. And the police are trying to make a demarcation between what they call racially aggravated and racial motivation to justify the increase, which is just semantic. I mean, what they're saying is there's a neighbor dispute, and because of COVID, people are using racist terms. That's always been the case, It's a new phenomenon. So some things have got worse. Yes, we have representation in parliament, but we have to be honest with ourselves. We don't want representation simply because the person looks like our skin color. We want people there who can reflect our lived experience on a day-to-day basis and use parliament as a tool to improve the quality of life of people. And that's not happening in parliament.
So, as you say, some things have improved, some haven't, and some have gone backward. Can we just go back again now to that period in the 70s after the death of Gurdeep Chugga? And you were talking about Southall and the rise of the Southall youth movement. So what happened in 1979 and 1981, these incendiary moments in Black and Asian history in Britain, and certainly in Sikh and Punjabi history in Britain? What happened and how did it come to that situation?
You can't separate. You're absolutely right. When we look at the history, and this is a living history for people like me and my generation, you can't separate 76, 79, and 81. There's a series of connected events. Really important to remember. The 76 have described the killing of Chakra. What happens in Chakra's case is the birth of the youth movements, and Southall becomes a beacon for Asian resistance across the country. So people begin in other towns to replicate youth movements. So you have youth movements in Bradford, in Leicester, in Birmingham, etc., etc. So Southall was seen as not just a shopping area where large Asian migrants lived, but also the house, the platform, the beacon of Asian resistance in this country in terms of challenging racism. And what's happening from 76 to 79 when Margaret Thatcher comes to power is the growth of the far right and the narrative of xenophobia and open calls for repatriation of all migrants and immigrants. This is what we were called at that time, immigrants, which we were, but we were never seen as British Asians. So the National Front, which was the equivalent of the EDL and the BNP, was gaining electoral strength. And when the election was called in 1979, the National Front deliberately used the election period to go to so-called immigrant areas, have public meetings, and call for open deportation and repatriation of people. So they chose St. George's Day, 23rd of April, 1979, to occupy the Southall Town Hall. And people mobilized, local communities organized together and differently. So the Southall Youth Movement asked for its members to mobilize. The Indian Workers Association, a lot of trade unions came on board. There was a demonstration a day before on the 22nd of April asking the council leader, which was leading council was controlled by the Conservative Party at that time, to stop the National Front holding its public meeting at the town hall the next day. They didn't listen. There were about 5,000 people who demonstrated. On the 23rd of April, I can only describe this as a militarized police operation because when you look at the day, it is one of the worst terror nightmare days that I've ever witnessed in my life. From 11 onwards, you have the Special Patrol Group and armed units of police forces taking control from the local police division and creating a sterile area. They called it a sterile area around the Southall Town Hall. So nobody could enter the main living parts of Southall in the center or leave from 11:30 onwards. So even if you wanted to leave, you would confront a cordon of police officers which were 4 deep. And if you wanted to go home, you couldn't go home. They started arresting the youth movement peaceful pickets from 11 onwards. The meeting was supposed to be at 7:30. From 11:30 to 6:30, they kept arresting people. It came into a confrontation when the National Front members, none of them lived in Southall, were escorted by police from outside Southall into the town hall. Before they went in the town hall, they gave their Heil Hitler signs and called for open repatriation. They went into the town hall. They actually threw a Daily Mirror reporter because they thought Daily Mirror was supportive of Asian community. And when people tried to rush and come to the town hall, the brutality, the orgy of violence that I saw it's like you were occupied by a military.
It sounds like a colonial, an image from a colonial story.
Let me explain exactly what happened because it's pivotal to the history of race resistance in this country. In a period of 2 hours, you had 800 people arrested. You had 345 people charged with various criminal offenses. People who were arrested were actually some of them taken to Uxbridge or 6 miles away in motorways and released. I was arrested, and when I asked for a solicitor, I was slapped and said, I got slapped by a police officer who told me that I've been watching too many American movies. That's the kind of treatment.
Yeah.
I laugh at it because whatever. Then you were tried at Barnet Magistrate, which is 20 miles over. We didn't have juries trying us. We had stipendiary magistrates brought from Northern Ireland called the Diplo courts during the Troubles to Barnet, special magistrates from Northern Ireland. And we had a conviction rate of 80% in the beginning, right?
What?
And on the day, they actually picked a number of places where they wanted to attack, the police I'm talking about. So one of the places they picked was the People's United Center, which housed the reggae group Misty Roots. And other musical bands like the Ruts and the Clash, punk bands which used that place as a sound system. They went in, 3 people down the gauntlet. threw down the stairs. Everybody who came out of the party was hit by truncheon. They actually hit an ambulance driver, beat him up when he was treating another protester. He
Goodness
stood
me.
that later. And then they went downstairs into the soundproofing system and smashed the misting roof equipment and actually used razor blades to cut the soundproofing system. I mean, it's just vindictive. And then a month later, the council leader agreed to demolish the building. So they demolished the first ever building run by People's Unite, which is a mixture of Asian, mainly African Caribbean and white youth. And the council leader got an OBE for community relations. So not only did he suffer the brutality of that day and got criminalized, but on top of it, they actually legitimized and awarded the person responsible for carrying it out with an OBE. That's the kind of sickening, racist reality that we were facing on that day. Anyway, we campaigned for years on two issues. One was to get people free, have their convictions squashed, and the other was about getting Blair Peach's murderer. And I've been working with his partner, Celia Stubbs, from 1979 up to today. And it's only in 2005 the Metropolitan Police Commissioner agreed that somebody in the Special Patrol Group, Unit Number 1, was responsible for Blair Peach's murder. You know, when we went to the coroner, I always remember this. The coroner called Dr. John Burton, did two things which are so scandalous, and there are books written on this. The first thing he does, he actually blames Blair Peach for his own death. He says that his cranium was too thin. It wasn't that the immense blow that was hit by
Goodness.
that hit him. And you know, when the police complaint system raided the SPG offices, they found equipment which are totally unlawful. He blamed Blair Peach for having a thin skull. And the second thing he did was that I want to create a hypothesis. He put forward a hypothesis in the coroner's court, which looks at how Blair died. And he said maybe he was killed by one of his own left-wing friends to make him into a martyr. But there's no evidence of it.
Goodness me.
It's just systematic undermining of people who simply wanted to come out on the streets and challenge the vitriolic, xenophobic, wild racism of the National Front. And Blair was simply killed for showing a remarkable quality that humans have when somebody suffers injustice, and that is called solidarity. He was killed simply for being in Southall. And, you know, how do you deal with that? And I think he was killed, and we've always said that because he actually looked, he obviously had Maori blood. I've never met Blair, but I only saw his, you know, when he died, and we ensured that Southall paid respect to him, and we lay him in state at the Dominion Cinema, and thousands of people came out to the cinema, to his coffin, and paid their respect. Because he looked Asian, you know? He looked like a Sikh guy with brownish skin and with his beard and mustache. And I think the police didn't care who they were beating. They randomly beat up. I've never seen violence like that. I'm just shocked that only one person died. That's what is shocking about the whole thing. I think we were lucky that only Blair Peach was killed that day. That's the only miracle that I can think of. Anyway, so 79 is a pivotal period in the history of race relations and the resistance and the challenge to racism, where the Asian community, especially the Punjabi community in Southall, plays a pivotal role. You know, I say that now, I mean, we didn't see ourselves as Punjabis, we saw ourselves as Asians or black and unifying each other. But people have, culturally, we were obviously Punjabi, and, you know, even when we were fighting, the kind of music that we listened to was, you know, Didar Singh Pradesi or this or, you know, whatever. So, you know, the 79 period, we spent masses of time in terms of building up campaign to support everybody who was arrested. But as Thatcherism gained hold in terms of privatizing companies, in terms of attacking trade unions, which affected Asian communities disproportionately, because most of our fathers or mothers were working in factories or in the service sector like Heathrow Airport. More and more people were getting unemployed. Police powers were being increased by Thatcher. And you had an explosion in 81 where there were public order disturbances in about 30 cities, principally to do with policing and poverty. And Southall had two what people call riots. So on the 3rd of July, a skinhead band wanted to play at Hambro Tavern, and we'd heard about it. We kept saying to the police, you can't allow them, this is going to end up in trouble. And then we thought they weren't going to come, and then suddenly they turned up. They came out, their supporters came in one coach load. They parked outside Hambro Tavern. They came onto Broadway. They attacked an Asian woman, and then they started breaking the windows. We started, fighting on the streets. We mobilized really quickly, and they started retreating, because it was for us a pivotal period where we had to defend our communities, and the defeat of that skinhead movement meant that we've never seen skinheads or fascism in Southall ever again. So I'm not saying that violence is the answer, but so 81 is a turning point for people in Southall. Some of the gains that have been made of creating communities actually arise out of the 81 period. And if you look at it historically, we were recruited from Punjab and the West End to service the industries and repair the war-torn economy of this country.
Yes.
Our fathers and mothers worked in foundries, in hospitals, in the transport. We did the night shift, service industry, cheap labor, ununionized. We fought for the unions. More importantly, we actually created communities out of towns that were they were inner city conurbations, rubble, on the decaying inner city areas, which nobody wanted to live in. So when you came to Southall, the houses were cheaper. And irony is, even during so-called market economy, if Asians lived in one area, it would get cheaper, So we created communities out of the rubbles of that industrial decaying areas. That's our strong. And what did we have? We had the memories of our resistance in India or the Caribbean or Africa, and we brought our culture and we brought our collective memories to build communities. And we had resilience and we had fortitude, and we found strength out of adversity. That's actually what our history is, and people forget it. And that's the pivotal context of the 81. So obviously it uses violence, but actually the context is us trying to live in this country as equal citizens, and we're not being allowed to do that, despite the contributions we make to repair the economy of this country.
It's a sickening irony, Suresh. I've often thought exactly what you've just said. Most of us were invited here to help build this country back up after the war. And the war itself saw, I think, over 2 million South Asian soldiers fighting for the Allied forces. And you had some of those veterans and the children of those veterans coming to this country, and other Black and Asian people coming to this country to do exactly what you said. And in doing so, they faced horrific racism, the racism that you and others sadly had to fight back against. And as you say, 1981 definitely was a turning point. I remember as a kid, we lived 10, 12 miles away from Southall. We used to go there occasionally on trips in the 70s and to the Gurdwara. And I remember a family came to visit us after Hambro Tavern. And these young boys who I'd never met before, they were early teenage boys, they were jubilant. They were elated, and they couldn't wait to tell me what had happened and how they had beat the skinheads. And so, I mean, even from my at distance recollections, I knew this was happening and that things were changing.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Sikh Messenger Podcast, be sure to stay tuned for the next episode, in which we continue our interview with Suresh Grover and talk to him about his work with the monitoring group.